Don Rickles walked onto the Tonight Show stage on September 18, 1986, with the same energy he had brought for decades. The audience erupted. Johnny Carson smiled and shook his hand. But 8 minutes into the interview, Rickles said something that made Carson's face change in a way the crew had never seen before. Carson stood up, thanked Rickles for coming, and walked off his own stage while the cameras were still rolling. The friendship between Johnny Carson and Don Rickles had defined a certain era of American comedy. It was built on insults, yes, but insults delivered with an understanding that both men knew where the boundaries were. Rickles could call Carson anything he wanted in front of millions of people. He could mock his marriages, his Midwestern roots, his carefully maintained hair. Carson would laugh, fire back occasionally, and the audience would feel like they were watching two brothers who genuinely loved each other. That was the contract. That was the game they had played since 1965. But something had shifted by 1986. Carson was in his early 60s. He had recently gone through his third divorce. The press had been brutal about it, suggesting that Carson was incapable of maintaining real relationships, that his warmth on television was a carefully constructed illusion that disappeared the moment the cameras turned off. Carson rarely responded to these accusations publicly. He believed that engaging with personal criticism only gave it more power, but those close to him knew the coverage had affected him more deeply than he admitted. The Tonight Show remained the most watched program in late-night television. Carson's ratings had not declined. His salary negotiations with NBC continued to favor him overwhelmingly. From the outside, nothing had changed. But inside Studio One at NBC Burbank, the atmosphere had grown more controlled. Carson had always been a perfectionist, but now his need for control extended beyond the monologue and the sketches. He began reviewing guest segments more carefully. He asked producers to brief him more thoroughly on what topics guests might raise. He wanted fewer surprises. The show had been on the air for 24 years by this point. Carson had conducted an estimated 23,000 interviews. He had developed an almost supernatural ability to guide conversations, to sense when a guest was uncomfortable, to redirect energy when things went wrong. But that skill had also created a kind of vigilance that never turned off. Even in casual moments backstage, Carson was always performing a version of assessment, always calculating what could go wrong and how to prevent it. His personal life had become a subject of fascination, precisely because he revealed so little of it. The divorces were public record, but the reasons behind them remained mysterious. Carson did not discuss his marriages in interviews. He did not write a memoir. He did not appear on other talk shows to explain himself. This silence created a vacuum that the press filled with speculation, and much of that speculation painted Carson as emotionally unavailable, as a man who saved all his humanity for the camera and had nothing left for the people who loved him. The third divorce, from Joanna Holland, had been particularly painful. They had been married for nearly 13 years. The settlement was rumored to be one of the largest in Hollywood history. Joanna had given a few carefully worded interviews suggesting that Carson was more interested in being Johnny Carson than in being a husband. She did not say it with anger. She said it with a kind of resigned understanding, which somehow made it worse. Don Rickles did not operate within systems of control. His entire career was built on the destruction of predictability. He thrived in chaos. That was his gift and his burden. When he walked onto a stage, he assessed the room, identified the targets, and fired. He had been doing this for 40 years. It had made him wealthy and beloved. But it had also created a lifetime of moments where he went too far, apologized privately, and then went too far again the next time, because that was who he was. Rickles had built his career on a very specific principle. Nothing was off limits if it was funny. He insulted people's appearance, their intelligence, their heritage, their careers. But there was an understanding, an unspoken agreement, that the insults came from a place of affection. When Rickles called you a hockey puck, it meant he liked you. When he destroyed you in front of an audience, it meant you mattered enough to destroy. His relationship with Carson had always been one of his most visible friendships. They had known each other since the early 60s, when both men were still establishing themselves. Rickles had appeared on The Tonight Show more than 100 times. He was one of the few guests who could make Carson genuinely laugh, the kind of laugh where Carson would lean back in his chair and lose control for a moment. Those moments were gold for the show. They felt real in a way that most television did not. The booking for the September 18 episode had been routine. Rickles was promoting a new comedy special. The producers did not feel the need to give Carson a detailed briefing. Rickles was Rickles. Carson knew what to expect, or so everyone assumed. The day of the taping, Carson arrived at the studio in the early afternoon. He recorded the monologue, ran through the sketches, and reviewed the guest list. Rickles was scheduled as the first guest. There was a second guest after him, a young actress promoting her first film, and then a musical performance. It was a standard show. Rickles arrived at the studio around 4 in the afternoon. He spent time in the green room, chatting with the producers, making jokes about the other guests. He was in good spirits. He had just returned from a successful run in Atlantic City. His comedy special was getting strong advance interest. Everything in his career was going well. The show began taping at 5:30. Carson delivered his monologue to a warm audience. The jokes landed well. He seemed relaxed. After the monologue, he sat down at his desk, took a sip of coffee, and waited for the commercial break to end. When the cameras came back on, he introduced Don Rickles with genuine enthusiasm. The audience stood and applauded as Rickles walked out. The interview began exactly as it always did. Rickles insulted the band. He insulted Ed McMahon. He made a joke about Carson's suit. The audience laughed the way they always laughed when Rickles appeared. Carson leaned back in his chair with that familiar smile, the one that told the audience he was in on the joke. For the first few minutes, it felt like every other Rickles appearance. Comfortable. Rehearsed in its spontaneity. Rickles talked about his recent shows in Atlantic City. He told a story about a heckler who had challenged him during a performance. The story was funny and self-deprecating, in the way Rickles' stories always were. Carson laughed genuinely. The energy in the studio was warm. Then Rickles began talking about marriage. It was not an unusual topic for him. He had been married to Barbara Rickles since 1965, and he often made jokes about how she tolerated him. He started with a joke about how he had to check with Barbara before accepting any work because she controlled his schedule. The audience laughed. Carson nodded knowingly. But then Rickles shifted the focus. He started talking about how difficult it must be to stay married when you were as famous as Johnny Carson. The audience laughed nervously. Carson's smile remained, but his posture changed slightly. He sat up a little straighter. His hands, which had been relaxed on the desk, moved to grip the edge. Rickles continued. He said something about how Carson had been married so many times that NBC should give him a bulk discount on divorce lawyers. The audience laughed harder, though there was an edge to it now. Carson nodded, playing along, but his smile had become fixed. Then Rickles said the line. He said that maybe the problem was not the women. Maybe the problem was that Carson was so good at pretending to be warm on television that he forgot how to actually be warm when the cameras turned off. Maybe Johnny Carson, the host, was so convincing that Johnny Carson, the person, had disappeared entirely. The laughter in the studio did not disappear immediately. It faded in stages. Some audience members were still laughing because they assumed this was part of the act. Others had stopped because they sensed something in Carson's face. Carson was no longer smiling. He was looking at Rickles with an expression that the crew would later describe as hurt and anger compressed into a single moment. The camera operators suddenly did not know where to point their cameras. One operator zoomed in slightly on Carson's face, capturing the exact moment when his expression changed. The director, watching from the control room, felt his stomach drop. He had been directing The Tonight Show for 12 years. He had never seen Carson look like this. Rickles seemed to realize he had miscalculated. His own smile faltered. He tried to pivot. He made a joke about himself, something self-deprecating to shift the energy. He said that he was probably describing himself more than Carson. But Carson was no longer listening. Carson turned to the audience. His face had returned to a neutral expression, the kind of expression he used when he was ending a segment that was not working. He said, in a voice that was perfectly calm and perfectly cold, that they had been very lucky to have Don Rickles on the show tonight. He stood up. The action was so sudden that Rickles did not have time to react. Carson extended his hand. Rickles, confused, stood up and shook it. Carson thanked him again, still in that same calm voice. And then Carson turned and walked off the stage. The audience did not know how to react. Some thought it was a bit. Others looked around confused. A few people started to applaud hesitantly, then stopped when they realized no one else was applauding. Ed McMahon stood up as if to say something, but Carson was already gone. The stage manager stood frozen. In 24 years, Carson had never walked off his own show. Rickles sat back down at the desk, looking at Doc Severinsen. Doc gave a small shrug. The audience began to murmur. The director cut to commercial 30 seconds early. During the commercial break, chaos erupted backstage. Carson went directly to his dressing room and closed the door. He locked it from the inside. Producers knocked. He did not answer. Fred de Cordova stood outside the door and tried to explain that they still had 12 minutes of show left to fill. Carson did not respond. The stage manager told Rickles they were going to bring out the next guest. Rickles nodded and walked off the stage without saying anything. In the green room, he sat down and stared at the wall. He looked genuinely shaken. The show continued. Ed McMahon took over hosting duties. The young actress did her interview. The musical act performed. The credits rolled. The audience filed out, whispering to each other, trying to make sense of what they had witnessed. Carson remained in his dressing room for 40 minutes after the taping ended. Finally, around 8 o'clock, he emerged. He looked composed. He told de Cordova that he was going home and that he would see them tomorrow. De Cordova asked if they should talk about what happened. Carson said no. Rickles left the building without speaking to anyone. He got into his car and sat in the parking lot for several minutes. He called his wife Barbara. He told her something had gone wrong, that he thought he had hurt Carson, but he did not understand how. The episode was scheduled to air 3 days later. The producers faced a decision. They could air the segment as it happened or edit it to look normal. They chose to edit. The version that aired on Monday night showed a pleasant conversation. The joke about Carson's marriages was trimmed. The final line about Carson being unable to be warm off camera was removed entirely. Viewers at home saw nothing unusual. But inside NBC, the incident became legend immediately. Word spread through the building within hours. Details became exaggerated. The myth grew. Carson did not explain himself to anyone. He showed up the next day and recorded that night's show as if nothing had happened. When producers asked if they should reach out to Rickles, Carson said no. When they asked if Rickles should be banned from future appearances, Carson said no. He simply did not want to discuss it. Don Rickles called Carson's office 4 times in the following week. Carson did not take the calls. Rickles sent a letter. Carson read it, folded it, and put it in his drawer. He did not respond. The letter was apologetic but confused. Rickles wrote that he valued their friendship and would do anything to make it right, but he did not understand what he had done wrong. Carson never answered the letter. At industry events over the next several months, mutual friends tried to facilitate a reconciliation. Frank Sinatra called Carson and suggested they all have dinner. Carson politely declined. Bob Newhart tried a similar approach. Carson gave the same answer. He was not angry, he told them. He simply did not want to continue the friendship. This response confused everyone. If he was not angry, why the complete silence? The answer was that Carson did not process emotions the way most people did. He did not yell. He did not confront. He simply removed himself from the situation entirely. What confused everyone was that the joke Rickles had made was not objectively worse than jokes he had made before. He had insulted Carson's marriages on previous appearances. Carson had always laughed. So why was this different? The answer, according to those who knew Carson well, was timing. The joke had landed at a moment when Carson was already questioning the gap between his public image and his private reality. His ex-wife had given interviews suggesting that Carson was emotionally distant, that he saved all his charm for the cameras and had nothing left when he came home. Carson had read those interviews. He had absorbed them. And then Don Rickles had essentially repeated the same accusation on live television in front of millions of people. It was not that the joke was cruel. It was that the joke was true, or at least true enough that Carson could not laugh at it. The silence between Carson and Rickles lasted for 14 months. During that time, Rickles continued to appear on other talk shows. He told the same kinds of jokes, but he never mentioned Carson. When interviewers asked about their friendship, Rickles would say they were fine and change the subject. Privately, Rickles told friends that he missed Carson. He missed being on The Tonight Show. But more than that, he missed the friendship itself, the off-camera phone calls, the dinners, the sense that he had a real connection with someone in an industry full of superficial relationships. Carson, meanwhile, continued hosting The Tonight Show as if nothing had changed. His ratings remained strong, his monologues were sharp, but those who worked with him noticed a shift. He became more guarded in interviews. He asked guests fewer personal questions. When conversations veered toward emotional territory, he redirected them toward humor. The reconciliation happened in December 1987, but not because either man reached out. Barbara Rickles called Carson's office and told his assistant that Don was miserable. The assistant passed the message to Carson. 2 days later, Carson called Rickles. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. Carson told Rickles that he was not angry anymore. Rickles apologized. Carson accepted the apology. They agreed to have dinner. And that was it. The friendship resumed, but it was never quite the same. They had dinner at an Italian restaurant in Beverly Hills. They talked about work, about their families, about golf. They did not talk about what had happened. They simply agreed, silently, to move forward. Rickles appeared on The Tonight Show again in March 1988. The audience gave him a standing ovation. Carson welcomed him warmly. They exchanged insults. They laughed. To anyone watching, it looked like nothing had ever happened. But Rickles was more careful now. He stayed away from certain topics. He kept the jokes aimed at safer targets. Never Carson's marriages. Never Carson's emotional life. Carson never publicly discussed the incident. In interviews over the years, when asked about his friendship with Rickles, he would say that Don was one of the funniest people he had ever known. He did not mention the fight. He did not explain what had happened. That was consistent with how Carson handled most conflicts in his life. He did not publicly process pain. He absorbed it, adjusted his behavior, and moved forward. Don Rickles, in his later years, came closer to addressing what had happened. In his 2007 memoir, he wrote about how much Carson's friendship had meant to him and how devastated he had been when Carson stopped speaking to him. He did not describe the specific joke that caused the rift, but he acknowledged that he had hurt Carson in a way he had not intended. He wrote that the experience taught him that even in comedy, there were lines that should not be crossed, no matter how close the friendship. He wrote about the 14 months of silence and how they had haunted him. He wrote about calling Carson's office and never getting a call back. He wrote about the relief he felt when they finally reconciled, even though the friendship was different afterward. The incident revealed something fundamental about Johnny Carson that the public rarely saw. For all his warmth and humor on camera, Carson was deeply protective of his private self. He had constructed a persona that felt authentic enough to sustain a 30-year career, but that persona had boundaries. When those boundaries were violated, even by someone he loved, Carson withdrew completely. It was not vindictiveness, it was self-preservation. The relationship between a comedian and a talk show host is always complicated by power. Carson had the platform. He decided who got to appear, who got to promote their projects, who got to reach millions of viewers. Rickles needed that platform to stay relevant. But their friendship had always felt like it transcended that power dynamic. The incident on September 18, 1986, shattered that illusion. It reminded both men, and everyone watching, that Carson was always in control. He could end the conversation whenever he wanted. He could walk off his own stage, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. The Tonight Show operated on the premise that Johnny Carson was everyone's friend. He was the guy you invited into your living room every night. He laughed at your jokes and made you feel comfortable. The show's entire appeal was built on the idea that Carson genuinely cared about his guests and his audience. But the truth was that he was not everyone's friend. He was a performer who had mastered the appearance of friendship. He could make anyone feel like the most important person in the world for 7 minutes. But when those 7 minutes ended, so did the relationship. And when that performance was challenged, when someone pointed out the mechanics behind the warmth, Carson did what he always did. He disappeared. This was not unique to his relationship with Rickles. Carson had ended friendships before. He had cut people out of his life for reasons that seemed minor to everyone else, but felt significant to him. What made the Rickles incident different was its visibility. It happened on camera. It happened in front of an audience. Don Rickles died in 2017 at the age of 90. In the obituaries, many writers mentioned his legendary appearances on The Tonight Show and his close friendship with Johnny Carson. Some of the obituaries included clips of Rickles insulting Carson, while Carson laughed uncontrollably. They were beautiful moments, full of genuine affection, but they were also incomplete. They did not show the moment when the laughter stopped, when the friendship fractured, when 8 seconds of truth broke 40 years of trust. Carson had died in 2005, 12 years before Rickles. In his final years, he rarely spoke publicly. He did not give interviews. He did not appear on television. He played tennis, spent time with his family, and slowly erased himself from public life. When he died, the tributes focused on his brilliance as a host, his generosity to young comedians, his unmatched ability to make people feel seen. Very few mentioned how difficult he was to actually know. Very few talked about the friendships that had ended without explanation, the colleagues who had been frozen out, the emotional walls that never came down. The footage of the September 18, 1986 episode still exists in NBC's archives, including the unedited version that shows Carson walking off the stage. It has never been released publicly. The network has no plans to release it. Some things, they decided, should remain private. But the people who were in Studio One that night remember. They remember the silence after Carson left. They remember the confusion on Rickles' face. They remember the way the audience looked at each other, trying to understand what they had just witnessed. And they remember the lesson that moment taught them about Johnny Carson and about the distance between the person we see on television and the person who exists when the cameras stop rolling. That distance, it turned out, was wider than anyone imagined. Carson had built a career on making that distance feel small, on making millions of people believe they knew him. But the truth was that almost no one knew him, not his wives, not his closest friends, perhaps not even himself. The incident with Rickles was not the end of Carson's ability to project warmth. He continued hosting The Tonight Show for another 6 years. He continued making audiences laugh. He continued making guests feel comfortable. But something had shifted, something subtle that only the people who worked with him every day could detect. When Carson finally retired in 1992, he did so on his own terms. His final show was a masterpiece of controlled emotion. He thanked his crew, his audience, and his guests. He appeared genuinely moved. But even then, there was a reserve, a part of himself he kept locked away. Bette Midler sang to him. He cried. The audience cried. It felt like a genuine moment of vulnerability. But Carson had approved every element of that final show. Even his tears were scheduled. And then he disappeared. He stopped appearing on television entirely. He turned down every interview request. He refused to participate in retrospectives. He simply vanished from public life. The lesson of September 18, 1986 was not that Johnny Carson could not take a joke. The lesson was that Carson could not tolerate being truly seen. The joke Rickles made was not cruel or unfair. It was accurate. And accuracy when it came to his private self was the one thing Carson could not forgive. That night ended a friendship. But more importantly, it revealed the fragility of the entire enterprise. The Tonight Show worked because audiences believed Johnny Carson was authentic. The moment someone suggested that authenticity might be performance, the entire illusion threatened to collapse. Carson walked off the stage that night to protect that illusion. He could not laugh at the joke because laughing would have been an admission. So he did the only thing he could do. He left. and in leaving he reminded everyone watching who was really in control.